You don't belong near such an expensive instrument. The wealthy woman's cold words cut through the room as she caught the black boy touching her daughter's piano. What happened next left everyone in the mansion completely speechless. Why did a boy who practices on an old church piano have the skills of a conservatory graduate? How could someone with no formal training play Liszt's La Campanella flawlessly despite being in excruciating pain? When this 15-year-old African-American prodigy placed his fingers on those keys, he shattered more than just expectations, he broke down walls built by prejudice and privilege. Witness this extraordinary transformation of hearts and minds in our full story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that will leave you inspired and moved. Michelle Washington stared at the cream-colored envelope in his hand, his dark eyes wide with disbelief. The paper felt expensive, like nothing he'd ever touched before. His name was written in perfect calligraphy on the front. You gonna open that or just stare at it all day? Ms. Reynolds asked, raising an eyebrow at him from across the classroom. Sorry, ma'am, Michelle mumbled, carefully breaking the seal. Inside was an invitation to Diana Harrington's 15th birthday party, Diana, the girl whose family owned half the businesses in town. Diana, who had never so much as looked in his direction before they'd been paired for their English project last week. What is it? Whispered Jamal, leaning over from the next desk. Nothing, Michelle said quickly, tucking the invitation into his backpack. The last thing he needed was everyone knowing he'd been invited to the rich girl's party. Probably a mistake anyway. After class, he was halfway down the hall when someone called his name. Michelle. Wait up. It was Diana herself, her blonde hair bouncing as she jogged toward him. 3 of her friends trailed behind, whispering and giggling. You got the invitation, right? Diana asked, not quite meeting his eyes. Yeah, I did. Thanks, but, my mom said I had to invite everyone from my project groups, she interrupted, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. It's this Saturday at 7. The address is on the card. Michelle nodded, suddenly understanding. This wasn't about friendship, it was about her mother's social appearances. I'll think about it, he said softly. Diana's perfectly glossed lips curved into a practiced smile. Great. Whatever. Oh, and it's formal, so wear something nice, okay? As she walked away with her friends, Michelle heard one of them say, I can't believe your mom made you invite him, followed by more giggling. Michelle's fingers found the edge of the invitation in his bag, tracing its ornate border. Despite everything, a small part of him wanted to go. Not for Diana, but for the chance to see inside one of those mansions on the hill, to experience, just for one night, what it might be like to belong in that world. He winced as a sharp pain shot through his lower back, a cruel reminder of why he always stood rather than sat when given the choice. Ms. Peterson's ruler had left more than just physical scars. That evening, as Michelle helped his grandmother prepare dinner in their small apartment, he finally pulled out the invitation. What's that you've got there? Grandma Washington asked, her hands coated in flour. Michelle hesitated before passing it to her. A birthday party invitation. From Diana Harrington. His grandmother's eyebrows rose as she carefully wiped her hands to examine the card. The Harrington girl? My. Michelle stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. The second-hand blazer his grandmother had found at the thrift store hung a little loose on his slender frame, but it was the best they could do on short notice. You look handsome, Grandma Washington said, appearing in the doorway. Her weathered hands reached up to straighten his collar. Your mama would be so proud to see you all dressed up. Michelle's throat tightened at the mention of his mother. For years gone, and the pain still felt fresh some days. I don't think I should go, Grandma, he said quietly. These aren't my kind of people. His grandmother's eyes softened. And what kind is that, Michelle James Washington? You know. Rich. White. He looked down at his scuffed shoes. The kind that look at me like I don't belong. Child, there's only one kind of people in this world, those who see the music in everything, and those who don't. She cupped his face in her hands. And you, my sweet boy, have always heard the music. Michel smiled despite himself. His grandmother had been saying that since he was 5 years old, plinking out melodies on the old upright piano at church. Before his back injury, before Ms. Peterson, before everything got complicated. Still hurting? She asked, noticing how he shifted his weight to one side. It's not too bad today, he lied. The truth was, it always hurt. 6 months ago, when he tried to sit in Ms. Peterson's class despite his already sore back from basketball practice, she'd assumed he was being disrespectful by squirming. Her wooden ruler had come down hard across his shoulders and back, aggravating what turned out to be a minor stress fracture into something much worse. The school had reprimanded her, but kept her on. His grandmother couldn't afford a lawyer to pursue it further. Mrs. Daniels next door said she can drive you, his grandmother said, changing the subject. I don't want you walking all that way up the hill. Grandma, go, she said firmly, pressing the invitation back into his hand. One night won't kill you. And who knows? Maybe you'll surprise them all. 30 minutes later, Michel found himself in Mrs. Daniels' ancient Buick, climbing the winding road toward the exclusive neighborhood where the Harringtons lived. Look at these houses, Mrs. Daniels whistled, peering through her thick glasses at the mansions they passed. Like something out of a movie. Michel just nodded, his stomach knotting tighter with each passing minute. What was he thinking, coming here? He should have stayed home, should have practiced piano at church like every other Saturday night. You know, my Johnny used to play ball with a Harrington boy back in the 70s, Mrs. Daniels was saying. Before they built this fancy neighborhood. They weren't always high and mighty. The car pulled up to an imposing gate, where a security guard checked the invitation before waving them through. Mrs. Daniels let out a low whistle as the Harrington estate came into view, a sprawling mansion of white stone and glass, with perfectly manicured gardens and a circular driveway where luxury cars were parked. Call me when you're ready to go home, Mrs. Daniels said as Michel stepped out of the car. No matter the time. Michel nodded, straightening his blazer as the Buick drove away. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the grand entrance, each step sending small jolts of pain up his spine. He almost turned back twice before reaching the massive double doors. But something, pride, curiosity, or perhaps his grandmother's faith in him, kept him moving forward. Michel raised his hand and knocked. The door swung open before Michel's knuckles had even left the polished wood. A tall man in a crisp uniform stood there, his expression professionally neutral as he assessed the young visitor. Good evening, sir. May I see your invitation? Michel fumbled in his pocket, producing the now slightly creased card. The man, a butler, Michel realized with amazement, examined it before nodding once. Mr. Washington. Please come in. The celebration is taking place in the main hall and garden. Stepping into the Harrington home was like entering another world. The ceiling soared high above, crowned by a crystal chandelier that scattered light like diamonds. Marble floors gleamed underfoot, and artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum adorned the walls. Michel stood frozen, overwhelmed by the opulence surrounding him. Music and laughter drifted from somewhere deeper in the house, reminding him why he was there. May I take your jacket, sir? The butler asked after a pause, eyeing Michel's thrift store blazer. No, thank you, Michel replied quickly, suddenly self-conscious about his second-hand clothes. Following the sounds of the party, he made his way down a wide hallway lined with family photographs, generations of smiling Harringtons, all looking polished and perfect. The main hall opened before him in a flood of light and sound. At least 30 teenagers in designer clothes clustered in groups, drinking from crystal glasses and sampling hors d'oeuvres carried by uniformed staff. French doors stood open to a garden illuminated by thousands of fairy lights, where more guests mingled around a sparkling pool. No one noticed Michel at first, allowing him a moment to gather himself. He spotted Diana across the room, resplendent in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than his grandmother's monthly rent. She was surrounded by friends, laughing at something one of them had said. You look lost. Michel turned to find a server holding a tray of drinks. Just taking it all in, he replied. The server, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, gave him a knowing smile. First time in the Harrington home? They do like to make an impression. She offered him the tray. Sparkling cider. Michel took a glass with a grateful nod. As he sipped the sweet drink, he caught sight of a woman watching him from across the room. She was shorter than most guests, with a plump figure and expensively styled gray-white hair. Her eyes, the same ice blue as Diana's, narrowed slightly as she assessed him. Mrs. Harrington. She whispered something to a man beside her, then began making her way toward Michel. He straightened instinctively, wincing as his back protested. You must be Michel, she said, her voice as polished as everything else about her. Diana mentioned you're working together on a school project. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for inviting me to your home. It's very. He searched for a word that wouldn't betray his awe. Impressive. Mrs. Harrington's smile didn't reach her eyes. Diana is required to invite her project partners. We believe in inclusion. She emphasized the last word as if it were a new concept she was trying out. I understand you live with your grandmother in the East Side apartments. The question felt like a test. Yes, ma'am. How quaint. Well, do enjoy yourself. Though I'd appreciate if guests would remain in the designated party areas. Her gaze flicked to his hand holding the crystal glass. Some of our possessions are quite valuable. Before Michel could respond, Diana appeared at her mother's side. Mom, Tyler's parents are looking for you, she said, barely acknowledging Michel's presence. Of course. Mrs. Harrington touched her daughter's shoulder. Stay with your guests, dear. As her mother moved away, Diana finally turned to Michel, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance. You actually came, she said. I did. Michel shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. Happy birthday. Diana's eyes traveled over his blazer and slacks, lingering on his scuffed shoes. Thanks. I didn't think you'd. I mean, I'm glad you could make it. The awkward moment was interrupted by a group of Diana's friends calling her name from the garden. Relief washed over her face. I should go. Help yourself to food and stuff. She gestured vaguely toward a table laden with appetizers before hurrying away. Left alone again, Michel drifted toward the edge of the room, the weight of belonging nowhere pressing heavily on his shoulders. Through the crowd, he caught fragments of conversation, vacations in Europe, private tennis lessons, new cars for 16th birthdays. A server passed with a tray of tiny, elegant food portions. Michel's stomach growled, reminding him he'd been too nervous to eat dinner. He took what looked like a miniature quiche, trying to appear as though he attended parties like this every weekend. As he ate, his gaze wandered across the room, and that's when he saw it. Through an open doorway in a quieter section of the house, something gleamed in the soft light of another room, the polished ebony surface of a grand piano. Michel lingered at the edge of the party for nearly an hour, watching the easy camaraderie of the wealthy teens. Occasionally, one would glance his way with a curious or dismissive look before returning to their conversation. He recognized a few faces from school, kids who passed him in the hallways without acknowledgement, now pointedly avoiding his gaze. Hey, you're in my math class, right? Michel turned to find a tall boy with sandy hair looking at him expectantly. Yeah. You sit near the front. Tyler, I think. That's right. Tyler took a sip from his glass. Didn't expect to see you here. Something in his tone made Michel's defenses rise. Diana and I are working on an English project together. Oh, right. The invite everyone rule. Tyler chuckled. Mrs. Harrington's big on appearances. Gotta look inclusive and all that. Before Michel could respond, two girls joined them, eyeing him with undisguised curiosity. Is this the piano guy? One asked Tyler, not bothering to address Michel directly. Piano guy? Michel echoed. Tyler shrugged. Word gets around. Someone said you play at that church on Jackson Street. I do sometimes, Michelle admitted, surprised they knew this detail about him. The girls exchanged glances, a silent communication that excluded him. So do you know any pop songs, or just the church stuff? The second girl asked, her voice dripping with condescension. I played different things. Michelle kept his voice neutral, refusing to be baited. He probably doesn't know anything by Beyoncé, the first girl stage whispered to her friend, giggling. Tyler at least had the decency to look embarrassed. Anyway, cool to see you here, man. He steered the girls away, leaving Michelle alone again. Across the room, he caught Mrs. Harrington watching him, her eyes tracking his movements like a security camera. When their gazes met, she didn't look away but instead said something to a uniformed staff member, who nodded and began making his way toward Michelle. Sir, the man said quietly upon reaching him, Mrs. Harrington asked me to ensure you have everything you need. The polite words couldn't disguise the underlying message, we're keeping an eye on you. I'm fine, thank you, Michelle replied, his throat tight with humiliation. As the staff member retreated, Michelle noticed Diana approaching with a group of friends. Their laughter died down as they neared him, turning to whispers behind manicured hands. Michelle, Diana said, her tone artificially bright, these are my friends from tennis club. Guys, this is Michelle from my English class. A chorus of half-hearted "heys" followed, none meeting his eyes. Diana, your mom is looking for you, one of the boys said, clearly inventing an excuse. Something about cutting the cake soon. Oh. I should go check. Diana seemed relieved. You all coming? They moved away as a unit, leaving Michelle behind without a backward glance. The pain in his back flared as tension built in his muscles. He needed to sit down but was hesitant to claim any of the expensive-looking furniture scattered around the room. Instead, he drifted toward an empty corner, leaning against the wall for support. From this vantage point, he could see Mrs. Harrington directing staff members in the garden, where a massive tiered cake was being positioned on a decorated table. She moved with practiced efficiency, her plump figure somehow commanding in a designer dress that probably cost more than his grandmother's monthly pension. The French doors to the garden opened, and the party moved outside for the cake ceremony. Michelle followed at a distance, grateful for the fresh air and the chance to blend into the background. As Diana posed for photos with her cake, surrounded by adoring friends, Michelle made a decision. He would call Mrs. Daniels as soon as the cake was cut. There was no point in staying where he was so clearly unwanted. But as the crowd shifted, Michelle found his gaze drawn back to that glimpse of ebony through the doorway inside. The grand piano pulled at him like a magnet, promising a moment of peace in this uncomfortable evening. Looking around, he saw that all attention was focused on Diana and her cake. No one would notice if he slipped away for just a moment. The pain in his back throbbed in time with his heartbeat as he quietly made his way back inside, toward the room with the piano, away from the stares and whispers, toward the one thing in this mansion that felt like it might welcome him. The music room was dimly lit, separated from the main celebration by heavy double doors that muffled the sounds of the party. Michelle stepped inside, drawn forward by the magnificent instrument dominating the space. It was a concert grand piano, its glossy black surface reflecting the soft light from recessed fixtures in the ceiling. Michelle had seen such pianos in magazines and videos of professional concerts, but never in person. The church piano he practiced on was an old upright with yellowed keys and sticky pedals that Mrs. Johnson tuned twice a year when she could afford it. This was something else entirely. Michelle approached slowly, almost reverently. The lid was propped open, revealing the intricate inner workings, strings and hammers positioned with perfect precision. A quick glance at the fallboard confirmed what he suspected, Steinway & Sons. The most prestigious piano maker in the world. The room itself was designed for music. Acoustic panels lined the walls, and plush carpet cushioned the floor. Bookshelves filled with sheet music stood against one wall, while the opposite featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking an illuminated garden different from the one where the party was happening. Michelle circled the piano once, not daring to touch it yet. Display cases nearby held what appeared to be musical awards and photographs of a younger Mrs. Harrington beside various famous musicians. She studied at Juilliard, Michel whispered to himself, reading a framed diploma on the wall. The revelation surprised him. He couldn't imagine the cold, suspicious woman who had greeted him pursuing something as emotional and expressive as classical music. Finally, unable to resist any longer, Michel stood before the piano bench. His back pain flared as he contemplated sitting down, reminding him of the last time he tried to sit at a school desk. Ms. Peterson's voice rang in his memory, "Stop fidgeting, boy. You'll sit properly or feel my ruler." Pushing the memory aside, Michel lowered himself carefully onto the bench, adjusting his position to minimize the pressure on his lower spine. Despite his discomfort, being before a piano again felt like coming home. His fingers hovered over the keys, not quite touching them. Would an alarm sound if he pressed one? Would security rush in to escort him out? Mrs. Harrington had made it clear he was to stay in the designated party areas, and this room was definitely not included. But the piano called to him. Just one note, he told himself. One touch to know what it felt like. Michel's finger descended gently on middle C. The note rang out, pure and resonant in a way his church piano could never produce. The sound hung in the air, perfectly sustained, before fading into silence. It was the most beautiful single note Michel had ever heard. Unable to help himself, he played a C major chord, then an arpeggiated G7. Each note was perfectly balanced, the action of the keys responsive to the lightest touch. Michel closed his eyes, letting his fingers drift across the keyboard in a gentle scale. For a moment, there was no party, no painful back, no Mrs. Harrington watching him with suspicious eyes. There was only the music, clear and true, flowing from his fingers like water. A floorboard creaked behind him. Michel's hands froze above the keys, his eyes flying open. In the reflection on the piano's polished surface, he could see Diana standing in the doorway, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You're not supposed to be in here," she said, not entering the room. "I'm sorry," Michel replied, carefully removing his hands from the keyboard. "I just saw it and... this room is off-limits to guests." Diana's voice was flat. "Especially the piano. It's very expensive." Michel began to stand, wincing as his back protested the movement. "I didn't mean any harm." Before Diana could respond, another figure appeared behind her, Mrs. Harrington, her face flushed with either exertion or anger as she took in the scene. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, pushing past her daughter into the room. Michel stood as straight as his pain would allow, his heart hammering in his chest. "I apologize, Mrs. Harrington. I shouldn't have come in here." Her eyes narrowed as they moved from Michel to the piano and back again. "No," she said coldly, "you shouldn't have." Mrs. Harrington's heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as she strode into the music room, her face tight with indignation. By now, several party guests had gathered in the doorway behind Diana, curious about the commotion. "This is my private music room," Mrs. Harrington said, her voice rising. "That piano is a handcrafted Steinway worth more than most cars. It is not a toy for guests to play with." Michel felt heat rising in his face. "I apologize, ma'am. I only played a few notes." "A few notes," she interrupted, incredulous. "Do you have any idea what oils from untrained hands can do to these keys? This instrument requires professional maintenance." The whispers from the doorway grew louder as more teens crowded to watch the spectacle. Michel could hear snippets of their comments. What did he think he was doing? Probably never even seen a real piano before. Did he really touch it? Mrs. Harrington turned toward the gathering crowd, as if suddenly aware they had an audience. Her expression shifted subtly, her outrage transforming into something more performative. "I invited you into my home," she continued, now projecting her voice for the benefit of the onlookers, "and this is how you repay that hospitality. By sneaking away from the party to handle expensive instruments." Michel's spine stiffened despite the pain. "I didn't sneak away to handle anything. I saw a beautiful piano and, what were you thinking would happen? Mrs. Harrington cut him off again. That you'd impress everyone with your church playing. She emphasized the word church in a way that made it sound primitive, unsophisticated. Diana stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. Mom, maybe we should. No, Diana, her mother insisted. Your friend needs to understand boundaries. She turned back to Michel. In this house, we don't touch things that don't belong to us. The implication was clear, nothing here belonged to Michel. He didn't belong here. A murmur ran through the group of watching teens. Some looked uncomfortable, but others were smirking openly now. Michel caught sight of the two girls from earlier, phones partially raised as if they might be recording the confrontation. Mrs. Harrington, Michel said quietly, fighting to keep his voice steady, I meant no disrespect. I play piano myself and was drawn to your instrument. I should have asked permission. You play piano? Her tone dripped with disbelief. She looked him up and down, taking in his second-hand clothes and scuffed shoes. And what sort of piano would that be? A keyboard? One of those electronic toys? Laughter rippled through the crowd. Michel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I play the piano at Greater Hope Baptist on Jackson Street, he replied, his voice stronger now. It's not a Steinway, but it makes music just the same. Mrs. Harrington's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. Well, I'm sure your church hymns are very quaint. But this instrument has been played by concert pianists. Real musicians. The dismissal stung worse than her anger had. Michel had been playing piano since he was 5 years old, taught first by his mother and then, after her death, by a succession of church musicians who recognized his talent. Even with his back injury, music remained the one place he felt truly free. Real musicians, Mrs. Harrington continued, warming to her topic as she played to her audience, understand that instruments of this caliber are to be respected. They require years of proper training and technique. Diana was looking increasingly mortified. Mom, it's fine. He didn't damage anything. That's not the point, Diana, her mother snapped. It's about respecting other people's property. About knowing your place. Those last words hung in the air like a slap. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implication. Michel stood as tall as his painful back would allow, dignity the only defense he had left. You're right, Mrs. Harrington. I should have respected the boundaries of your home. I apologize again for touching your piano. He turned to leave, preparing himself for the walk of shame through the crowd of staring teens. Wait. The voice came from the back of the gathered group. The teenagers parted as a girl Michel vaguely recognized from his history class stepped forward. Sophia Chen, the quiet, studious daughter of the town's most prominent surgeon. Mrs. Harrington, Sophia said with surprising authority, if Michel plays piano, maybe we should let him demonstrate. Then we can judge whether his hands are worthy of your instrument. Mrs. Harrington's eyes widened at being challenged. I hardly think. I'd like to hear him play, said another voice. Then another. Curiosity was spreading through the crowd, the prospect of potential embarrassment too enticing to pass up. Diana was looking at Michel with new interest. Yeah, Mom. Let's hear what he can do. Mrs. Harrington found herself suddenly outmaneuvered in her own home. She looked from the eager faces of the teens to Michel's dignified stance, calculating her options. Fine, she finally said, her voice tight. Since you're all so curious, let's hear our uninvited pianist demonstrate his talents. Her tone made it clear she expected a fiasco. One piece, she added. And then I think it would be best if you called for your ride home. The challenge was laid. Michel looked at the gleaming piano, then at the circle of expectant faces. This was not how he had imagined his evening going, but perhaps his grandmother had been right. Maybe he would surprise them all. The crowd of teenagers pressed into the music room, filling the space with whispers and expectant energy. Some looked eager for entertainment, others for the potential humiliation of an outsider. Michel stood beside the grand piano, uncomfortably aware of every eye trained on him. Mrs. Harrington remained near the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, her expression a mix of irritation and smug certainty. Diana hovered nearby, her earlier embarrassment now transformed into curiosity. "Well?" Mrs. Harrington prompted. "We're waiting. Or perhaps you've reconsidered." Michel took a deep breath. The pain in his back was a constant throb now, worsened by tension and the strain of standing. To play properly, he would need to sit, something that always intensified his discomfort. But the alternative was walking away in shame. "I'll play," he said quietly. As Michel carefully lowered himself onto the piano bench again, adjusting his posture to accommodate his injury, Sophia Chen moved closer. "Play something good," she whispered, offering an encouraging smile. "Show them." Michel nodded, gratitude warming his chest. It was the first genuine kindness he'd experienced all evening. The room fell silent as his hands hovered over the keys. What should he play? His mind raced through possibilities. Church hymns would only reinforce Mrs. Harrington's dismissive attitude. Simple classical pieces might not be impressive enough. Contemporary pop would seem like pandering. His fingers settled on the keys as he made his decision. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9, No. 2 filled the room, gentle, delicate, but technically demanding. It was one of the first pieces his mother had taught him to love, long before he was skilled enough to play it. For the first few measures, Michel was acutely aware of his audience. The weight of their judgment pressed on him as heavily as his back pain. But gradually, the music began to work its magic, not just on his listeners but on Michel himself. Note by note, he surrendered to the piece, his technique solid despite his discomfort. His body remembered what to do even as he navigated the pain, fingers finding their positions with practiced precision. The exquisite tone of the Steinway elevated the music beyond anything he could produce on the old church piano, and Michel found himself responding to the instrument, coaxing more nuance from each phrase. The whispers had stopped. From the corner of his eye, Michel could see the surprised expressions on the faces closest to him. Even Diana had drawn nearer, her practiced indifference giving way to genuine attention. As the piece progressed, Michel's confidence grew. He leaned into the emotional passages, allowing his interpretation to emerge, slightly slower in places, with subtle dynamic shifts that reflected his personal understanding of the music. His back screamed in protest at his posture, but the pain seemed to feed into his playing, giving the music an emotional depth that transcended technique. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then Sophia began to applaud, followed quickly by others. Several students looked genuinely impressed, exchanging glances that said, "Did you know he could do that?" Mrs. Harrington's expression had shifted from dismissive to calculating. She uncrossed her arms, studying Michel with new intensity. "That was competent," she conceded, her tone suggesting this was high praise. "Where did you learn to play Chopin?" "My mother taught me," Michel answered, carefully rising from the bench as the applause died down. "She studied music education before I was born." "And now? Who is your teacher?" "No one formal. Mr. Patterson at church helps me sometimes. Mostly I teach myself from videos and books from the library." This admission caused Mrs. Harrington's eyebrows to rise. "Self-taught? With that technique?" Before Michel could respond, Diana moved to the piano. "Can you play something else?" she asked, her previous disdain replaced by genuine curiosity. "Something more modern?" The request surprised Michel. He'd expected to be dismissed after fulfilling the challenge, not asked for an encore. He looked to Mrs. Harrington, who gave a small, reluctant nod. "One more," she said, "since you seem to have captured my daughter's interest." Michel sat again, wincing visibly this time as a sharper pain shot through his lower back. He shifted, trying to find a comfortable position, but there was none to be found. "Are you okay?" Sophia asked, noticing his discomfort. "It's nothing," he said automatically. "Just an old injury." But Diana had caught the exchange. What kind of injury? Michelle hesitated, unwilling to share the humiliating story of Ms. Peterson's ruler and the school's inadequate response. Sports, he said simply. Makes it hard to sit sometimes. This small confession seemed to humanize him further to the watching teens. Several nodded in understanding, athletes themselves familiar with persistent injuries. Turning back to the piano, Michel considered Diana's request for something modern. His fingers began to move, playing the opening of a popular ballad that had been topping the charts for weeks, but transformed, elevated by classical techniques and harmonies that made it both recognizable and entirely new. As the melody took shape, several teens began to hum along, then exchange impressed looks as Michel's arrangement grew more complex, incorporating elements that showed not just technical skill but creative musicality. The modern song transitioned seamlessly into something else, a bridge Michel was improvising, drawing elements from jazz and classical traditions into the pop framework. His eyes were closed now, pain and audience forgotten as he surrendered completely to the music that had been his refuge for as long as he could remember. More party guests drifted into the room, drawn by the unexpected performance. What had begun as a humiliating challenge was transforming into something else entirely, a genuine musical moment that transcended the social barriers that had defined the evening. Michel's fingers danced across the keys with increasing confidence. Each note on the Steinway sang with a clarity and resonance his church piano could never produce, inspiring him to push further, explore more, reveal what he could truly do when given an instrument worthy of the music in his head. From her position near the doorway, Mrs. Harrington watched with narrowed eyes, her original contempt giving way to reluctant professional assessment. As a Juilliard graduate, she recognized genuine talent when she heard it, regardless of its source. And what she was hearing defied her expectations. Diana had moved closer to the piano, her expression a mixture of surprise and growing respect. Other teens had pulled out their phones, recording snippets of the performance. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically, the mockery gone, replaced by genuine appreciation. As the improvised bridge came to a close, Michel opened his eyes briefly, catching sight of the now substantial audience. Rather than shrinking from their attention, he drew strength from it, transitioning into Debussy's Clair de Lune. The impressionist piece floated through the room like moonlight on water, delicate yet technically demanding. Two staff members appeared in the doorway, initially coming to investigate the gathering but remaining transfixed by the music. One, an older man, closed his eyes in appreciation of the familiar classic. Michel's back was on fire now, the prolonged sitting sending waves of pain up his spine. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he refused to stop. This moment, this chance to show what he could do, who he truly was beyond their assumptions, was too important to surrender to physical discomfort. The Debussy flowed from his fingers with fluid grace, each phrase carefully shaped. Years of practice, of losing himself in music when reality became too harsh, were evident in his command of the piece. Despite his youth, Michel played with the emotional maturity of someone who had known both joy and profound loss, translating those experiences into sound. As the piece built toward its climax, a hushed reverence fell over the room. Phones were lowered as listeners became too engrossed to bother recording. Even Mrs. Harrington had uncrossed her arms, her professional detachment cracking as the music reached toward its delicate peak. When the final notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence, no one spoke. The quiet held for several seconds, a tribute to the spell Michel had cast. Then the applause began, genuine, enthusiastic, and tinged with surprise. Exclamations of, "Wow," and, "That was amazing," rippled through the crowd of teens. Someone whispered, "Did you know he could play like that?" while another replied, "How does someone from the East Side learn to play like a concert pianist?" Diana had moved to stand directly beside the piano, any pretense of disinterest completely abandoned. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, echoing the whispered questions of her friends. Michel wiped the sweat from his brow with his sleeve, trying to mask the grimace of pain that threatened to break through his composure. "Music has always been part of my life," he answered simply. Mrs. Harrington had approached now, her earlier hostility replaced by professional curiosity. "Your technique suggests formal training," she stated, not quite a question. "Yet you claim to be self-taught." My mother was my first teacher, Michel explained, carefully shifting on the bench to alleviate some of the pressure on his spine. She studied at Howard University before I was born. After she passed, I continued on my own. Without a piano at home? Michel shook his head. We never had space or money for one. I practice at church or sometimes at the music store downtown if Mr. Campbell isn't busy with lessons. This revelation sent another ripple of murmurs through the onlookers. The idea that such skill could develop without the advantages they took for granted, private lessons, personal instruments, parents who could afford specialized education, challenged their assumptions. Play something else, urged a voice from the back of the room. Others joined the request, the mood now closer to a genuine recital than a moment of mockery. Michel glanced up at Mrs. Harrington, seeking permission. Despite her earlier demand that he leave after one piece, she gave a small nod, her professional interest overriding her social prejudices. Taking a deep breath to center himself through the pain, Michel placed his hands on the keys once more. This time, he chose Bach, the complex, mathematical precision of the prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. The piece began simply but grew increasingly intricate, displaying not just emotional interpretation but technical mastery. As he played, Michel became aware of phones being raised again, more videos being recorded. What had begun as a potential moment of humiliation was becoming something else entirely, a revelation, perhaps even a turning point. As the Bach prelude reached its conclusion, a tall man in a tailored suit stepped into the room. He moved with quiet authority through the crowd of teenagers until he stood beside Mrs. Harrington. "Elizabeth," he said softly, "who is this young man?" "A classmate of Diana's," Mrs. Harrington replied, her voice low. "Michel Washington. Apparently self-taught." Mr. Harrington studied Michel with keen interest as the piece came to an end. The room once again filled with applause, louder now as more guests had gathered. Michel remained seated, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he fought to control the pain. Sweat dampened his collar, and his hands trembled slightly as he lowered them to his lap. He'd pushed himself too far, but pride wouldn't let him show weakness in front of this audience. "Young man," Mr. Harrington called out as the applause died down, "your playing is exceptional. Where do you study?" Before Michel could answer, Diana stepped forward. "Dad, he says he practices at church and the music store. He doesn't have his own piano." Mr. Harrington's eyebrows rose in surprise. He exchanged a look with his wife, a silent conversation passing between them. "Is this true?" he asked Michel directly. Michel nodded, straightening his posture despite the pain. "Yes, sir. I get by with what's available." A new voice spoke up from the doorway, Sophia's. "He won the regional young artists competition last year. I was there with my cousin who competed. The judges said he was the most promising talent they'd seen in a decade." This revelation caused Mrs. Harrington to stiffen. The regional competition was prestigious, judged by conservatory professors and professional musicians. Winners typically went on to national competitions and, often, scholarships to elite music schools. "You never mentioned this," Mrs. Harrington said, an accusatory edge to her voice. Michel shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "It didn't come up." "Didn't come up?" Diana repeated, incredulous. "You let my mother treat you like you didn't know anything about music, when you've won competitions?" "Winning a competition doesn't give me the right to touch someone else's property without permission," Michel replied quietly. Mrs. Harrington was right about that. His grace in the face of humiliation seemed to affect the room more deeply than his playing had. Several teens looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with their earlier behavior. "Michel," Mr. Harrington said, moving closer to the piano, "my daughter tells me you have a back injury that makes it difficult to sit. Yet you've been playing for..." He checked his watch, nearly 20 minutes now. "That shows remarkable discipline." Michel shifted on the bench, unable to hide his wince this time. "Music helps me forget about the pain sometimes." "May I ask what happened?" The room grew quiet again, everyone waiting for his answer. Michel hesitated, reluctant to share the humiliating story, but something about the genuine interest in Mr. Harrington's eyes made him reconsider. "I had a minor stress fracture from basketball," he began slowly. "It was healing, but one day in class, I couldn't sit still because of the discomfort. My teacher thought I was being disrespectful and used a ruler across my back and shoulders. It made things worse." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Diana's eyes widened. "A teacher hit you? At our school? Who?" "Miss Peterson," Michelle answered softly. "Last semester." Recognition flashed across several faces. Ms. Peterson's strict methods were well known, though many of these privileged teens had never experienced the harsher side of her discipline. "That's assault," Sophia stated flatly. "Did the school do anything?" Michelle's silence was answer enough. Mrs. Harrington had grown very still, her earlier hostility replaced by something more complex. As a school board member, this revelation carried additional weight for her. "Michelle," Mr. Harrington said after a moment, "correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Young Artists competition winners are offered a scholarship to the summer program at Eastman School of Music. Did you attend?" Michelle shook his head. "I couldn't accept it. The scholarship covered tuition but not travel or housing. My grandmother and I couldn't afford the rest." This simple statement of economic reality landed heavily in the opulent room. For many of these teens, their parents routinely spent on a weekend what could have funded Michelle's entire summer program. "That's why I practice wherever I can," Michelle continued, his voice stronger now. "The church piano isn't great, but Mr. Patterson lets me use it whenever the building is open. And Mr. Campbell at Downtown Music is kind enough to let me play the display pianos when the store isn't busy." Diana had moved to stand directly beside Michelle, her earlier contempt completely transformed. "So every time I've seen you hurrying out of school, or missing lunch." "I was practicing," Michelle confirmed. "Any chance I get." Mrs. Harrington cleared her throat, visibly struggling with something. "The regional competition judges don't give praise lightly," she finally said. "I should know. I was a finalist in the same competition 30 years ago." Michelle looked up at her in surprise. "Though I didn't win," she added, a hint of a smile briefly softening her features. "Unlike you." Something had shifted in the room, not just the audience's perception of Michelle, but perhaps Michelle's understanding of Mrs. Harrington as well. Behind her cold exterior was someone who knew what it meant to pursue music seriously, to be judged on talent rather than background. "I think," Mr. Harrington said, addressing the room at large, "we've all been privileged to witness something special tonight. It seems Diana's birthday celebration has unexpectedly become a private concert by a genuine musical talent." A new energy permeated the room. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation had evolved into something no one could have predicted. The teens who had earlier whispered mockingly behind their hands now watched Michelle with newfound respect, some even appearing embarrassed by their previous behavior. Mrs. Harrington's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. The haughty disdain that had characterized her initial interaction with Michelle had given way to a professional assessment that couldn't deny his exceptional ability. She stood closer to the piano now, her arms no longer defensively crossed. "Would you play something else for us?" she asked, her tone entirely different from her earlier demands. "Perhaps Rachmaninoff? Or Liszt?" The suggestion revealed both her own musical knowledge and a new acknowledgement of Michelle's capabilities. These weren't pieces one would request from a casual player. Michelle nodded, despite the increasing discomfort in his back. 20 minutes on the piano bench had pushed his endurance to its limits, but the opportunity to play this magnificent instrument for an appreciative audience was too precious to surrender to pain. His fingers found the keys again, launching into Liszt's La Campanella, one of the most technically challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. The rapid hand crossings, precise jumps, and lightning-fast repeated notes demanded virtuosic skill, yet Michelle performed them with a fluidity that belied their difficulty. Several of the watching adults, parents who had come to collect their children and found themselves drawn to the impromptu concert, exchanged knowing glances. One leaned toward another and whispered, "That's conservatory-level playing. From a boy with no piano at home." The household staff had abandoned any pretense of working, gathering in doorways to listen. The older man who had appeared earlier now stood with tears in his eyes, watching Michelle's hands fly across the keyboard with preternatural precision. Diana had not moved from Michelle's side, her birthday celebration all but forgotten as she watched his performance with rapt attention. Her previous dismissal of him had transformed into open admiration, her eyes following his hands as they executed the complex piece. "I had no idea," she murmured, mostly to herself. "All this time in class together, and I never knew." As Michelle navigated the most challenging section of the piece, a collective tension filled the room, the shared recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even those without musical training could sense the remarkable skill on display, the years of dedication despite overwhelming obstacles. When he reached the final triumphant notes, Michel could no longer hide his physical distress. Pain radiated across his lower back in waves, and his posture had gradually collapsed throughout the performance. As the last chord rang out, he let his shoulders slump, breathing heavily. The audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. Several people rose to their feet, including Mr. Harrington and, after a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Harrington as well. The standing ovation spread until nearly everyone in the room was on their feet, applauding with genuine appreciation. "That was unbelievable," one boy said loudly, a classmate who had earlier ignored Michelle completely. "How did you learn to play like that without your own piano?" Michelle managed a tired smile. "Practice. Whenever and wherever I can." "But that piece," Mrs. Harrington said, professional respect evident in her voice. "That's conservatory material. Graduate level." "I found the sheet music at the library," Michelle explained. "And there are videos online where you can see the proper technique. I practice the fingerings even when I don't have access to a piano, on tabletops, on my knees, anywhere." This simple statement of determination silenced the room again. The contrast between Michel's circumstances and his accomplishments became impossible to ignore. Many of these teens had access to every advantage: private lessons, expensive instruments, parents who could nurture any talent or interest, yet how many had achieved this level of mastery in anything? Mr. Harrington moved forward, offering Michelle a glass of water. "You should rest," he said kindly. "You're in pain." Michelle accepted the water gratefully. "Thank you, sir." "No," Mr. Harrington replied firmly. "Thank you for reminding us all what genuine passion and perseverance look like." Mrs. Harrington had drawn closer, her earlier hostility completely evaporated. "Your mother taught you well," she said quietly. "She must have been very talented herself." "She was," Michelle confirmed, a shadow of grief crossing his face. "She wanted to be a concert pianist when she was young, but life had other plans." Something in Mrs. Harrington's expression shifted at these words, recognition, perhaps, of dreams deferred or altered by circumstance. Despite their vastly different lives, this was something she could understand. "Your technique is exceptional," she continued, now speaking as one musician to another rather than hostess to unwelcome guest. "But it's your interpretation that's truly remarkable. You play with emotional maturity beyond your years." Coming from her, the praise carried significant weight. Michel nodded his acknowledgement, too exhausted to fully process the dramatic reversal of his evening. Diana, who had been watching this exchange intently, suddenly turned to the crowd. "Everyone," she called out, claiming their attention with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to social leadership. "This is the best birthday present I could have received, discovering extraordinary talent in someone I see every day but never really saw." She looked directly at Michel. "I'm sorry for how I treated you earlier." "We all are." Several teens nodded in agreement, genuine remorse on their faces. "I think," Diana continued, "we should give Michel a break. He's been playing for nearly half an hour with a back injury." She glanced at her mother. "Maybe we could get him something for the pain. And a more comfortable chair." The concern was genuine, free from the condescension that had marked their earlier interactions. Michel felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in his hard-won ability, satisfaction at the recognition, but also wariness born from years of experience with fleeting acceptance. A comfortable armchair appeared, carried in by 2 staff members. Michel was helped from the piano bench to this more supportive seat, the transition revealing just how much pain he'd been enduring. His face contorted briefly before he managed to compose himself again, settling into the chair with a barely audible sigh of relief. Mrs. Harrington returned with a glass of water and what appeared to be pain medication. "It's just over the counter," she assured him, "but it might help take the edge off." Michel accepted gratefully, struck by the transformation in her demeanor. The woman who had earlier viewed him with suspicious disdain now showed genuine concern. The party had fundamentally shifted. What had been a standard wealthy teen birthday celebration had become something entirely different, a gathering centered around an unexpected talent, a moment of collective recognition that transcended the social barriers that typically defined their interactions. "I'm calling my father," Sophia announced, phone already in hand. "He's on the hospital board. This back injury needs proper treatment, not just pain pills." Michel shook his head. "I've seen doctors. There's not much to be done except physical therapy, which isn't covered by our insurance." This simple reality, the financial barriers to healthcare that shaped Michel's daily life, landed like a stone in the privileged space. Several parents exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware of inequities they generally managed to ignore. "That's unacceptable," Mr. Harrington stated firmly. "A talent like yours shouldn't be compromised by lack of proper medical care." Diana had perched on the arm of a nearby sofa, watching Michel with newfound respect. "I can't believe you've been dealing with this pain every day at school. How do you manage?" "I stand whenever possible," Michel explained. "It's why some teachers think I'm being difficult or disrespectful." "Like Ms. Peterson," Diana said, her expression hardening. "Dad's on the school board. This needs to be addressed." Mrs. Harrington nodded in agreement, any loyalty to her fellow educator outweighed by the evidence of Michel's mistreatment. A teacher striking a student is completely unacceptable, regardless of the circumstances. The conversation had drawn everyone in, the earlier social divisions temporarily dissolved by shared indignation at an injustice that now had a face and name they couldn't dismiss. "Michel," Mr. Harrington said after a moment, "would you be comfortable telling us more about your musical background? Your training, your goals." Put on the spot, Michel hesitated before responding. "My mother was my first teacher. She studied music at Howard but had to drop out when she got pregnant with me. She worked as a home health aide, but she taught piano on the side, and me whenever she could." A small smile touched his lips at the memory. "She said I had her musical gift but more discipline than she ever had." The room had quieted, everyone drawn into his story. "After she passed, I just kept playing. It was how I felt close to her. The church let me practice on their piano. A few of her former students gave me lessons when they could. The rest I figured out from books and videos." "And competitions?" Mrs. Harrington prompted, still processing the revelation that this boy had won a prestigious contest she herself had only placed in. "My middle school music teacher entered me in the first one. After that, I sought them out. They sometimes offer prize money or scholarships." Michel shifted in the chair, finding a less painful position. "Though as I said, the scholarship to Eastman wasn't enough." "What are your plans?" Mr. Harrington asked. "College? Conservatory?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions about choices and possibilities that might not exist for Michel. "I'll apply for scholarships," he answered carefully. "Juilliard, Eastman, Curtis, anywhere that might offer a full ride. But I need to be realistic. My grandmother depends on me to help around the house. And college applications aren't cheap." The casual reference to application fees, a minor expense for most families in the room but a significant barrier for Michel, caused another moment of uncomfortable recognition. Diana, who had been listening intently, suddenly sat up straighter. "Wait, you're in AP classes too, aren't you? I've seen you in the library during lunch." Michel nodded. "I maintain a 4.0 GPA. Music schools look at academics too." This additional revelation of academic excellence alongside musical genius further transformed the perception of the boy they had so easily dismissed. The realization that Michel had been excelling in every domain despite overwhelming obstacles made their earlier treatment of him seem even more shameful. One of the parents, a woman in an expensive dress and statement jewelry, spoke up. "I'm on the board of the Regional Arts Foundation. We have emergency grants for exceptional cases. This certainly qualifies. And I can speak to the physical therapy department at my hospital," added another parent. "Pro bono work is part of our community commitment." The offers continued, a sudden outpouring of support from adults with connections and resources, seemingly eager to make amends for the culture that had allowed Michel to be so thoroughly overlooked. Mrs. Harrington had gone quiet, watching this cascade of assistance with a complex expression. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new humility. "Michel," she said, "I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was inexcusable. I made assumptions based on prejudices I didn't even realize I was carrying." She glanced around the room, at her daughter, at their home. "We surround ourselves with people like us, and we forget to look beyond our bubble." The apology was genuine, all the more powerful coming from a woman who seemed unaccustomed to admitting error. Michel nodded his acceptance, too overwhelmed by the evening's turn of events to formulate a response. Diana moved to stand beside her mother. "I'm sorry too," she said, her usual polish replaced by genuine emotion. "For how I treated you at school, for today, for not seeing you." Michel looked between mother and daughter, seeing the same blue eyes, the same proud bearing, but now with a crack in the facade that revealed something more human underneath. 3 weeks after Diana's birthday party, Michel sat in the Harringtons' music room once again, this time as an invited guest. The grand piano gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, no longer a forbidden object but the reason for his presence. "Your posture is much improved," Mrs. Harrington observed from where she stood nearby, her critical eye now professional rather than judgmental. "The physical therapy is working?" Michel nodded, adjusting his position on the specialized cushion Dr. Chen, Sophia's father, had prescribed. "The exercises help. And not having to sit on those hard school chairs makes a big difference." The accommodation letter from Dr. Chen had transformed Michel's school experience. Teachers who had once viewed his standing as disrespectful now ensured he had appropriate seating or the option to stand without question. All except Ms. Peterson, who was currently on administrative leave pending an investigation. "Try the passage again," Mrs. Harrington suggested, pointing to a section of the sheet music. "Remember what we discussed about the pedaling." The weekly lessons had been her idea, a way to make amends that utilized her own expertise rather than just financial assistance. Though initially hesitant, Michel had accepted, recognizing the rare opportunity to study with a Juilliard-trained pianist. As Michel played the challenging section of Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, Diana appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with glasses of lemonade. She set it down quietly, careful not to interrupt the lesson. In the weeks since her birthday, Diana had become an unexpected ally. At school, her social influence had effectively ended the whispers and sidelong glances that had once followed Michel through the hallways. More significantly, she had publicly confronted instances of discrimination that she would previously have ignored or enabled. When the piece concluded, Mrs. Harrington nodded with approval. "Much better. You've clearly been practicing." "The church piano doesn't compare to this one," Michel admitted, "but Mr. Patterson says the congregation doesn't mind me practicing there more often now." "Well, consider this piano available to you whenever you need it," Mrs. Harrington said, her former territorial protectiveness replaced by genuine support. "Especially as you prepare for your auditions." The college application fees had been quietly handled by Mr. Harrington, and recommendation letters from both Harringtons, influential alumni at several prestigious conservatories, had been sent on Michel's behalf. Diana brought the lemonade over, handing glasses to both her mother and Michel. "Grandma Washington called," she told Michel. "She'll be here in about 20 minutes. She said to tell you she's bringing cookies for everyone." The friendship between Diana and Michelle's grandmother had been an unexpected development, two women from entirely different worlds finding common ground in their pride for Michelle and their shared appreciation for straight talk. "Have you decided which school you'll choose if you get multiple offers?" Diana asked, perching on a nearby chair. Michelle shook his head. "I'm trying not to get ahead of myself. The auditions are the hard part." "You'll have options," Mrs. Harrington stated with certainty. "Talent like yours doesn't go unrecognized in the music world, regardless of background." Her tone carried the weight of a personal reckoning with her own prejudices. The Harrington Foundation's newly established Music Access Program, inspired by Michelle's situation, would ensure that other talented students from underprivileged backgrounds would have instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities previously beyond their reach. "Michelle," Mrs. Harrington said, closing the sheet music, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Her tone shifted to something more personal. "Why didn't you hate us? After how we treated you that night, after years of being overlooked by people like us, you had every right to reject our help, our apologies." Michelle considered the question carefully, setting his glass down on a coaster. "My grandmother always says that hate takes too much energy," he finally answered. "And my mother taught me that music is about communication, about building bridges between different experiences." He gestured toward the piano. "When I play, all the barriers fall away, rich, poor, black, white, none of it matters. There's just the music." The simple wisdom in his words hung in the air, a gentle rebuke to the artificial divisions they had all perpetuated. "Besides," Michelle added with a small smile, "I really wanted to play this piano again." The laughter that followed was genuine, the sound of real connection across the divides of privilege and circumstance, of human recognition that transcended social categories. Outside, a car horn honked, Mrs. Daniels bringing Grandma Washington for her first visit to the Harrington home. As Diana went to greet them, Mrs. Harrington placed a hand briefly on Michelle's shoulder. "Thank you," she said simply, "for teaching us all to listen better." Michelle nodded, understanding that she meant more than just music. Then he turned back to the piano, his fingers finding the keys with confident grace, his back straighter, his future brighter, a young artist coming into his own, finally seen for who he truly was. Dear friend, this story reminds us that talent knows no boundaries of race, class, or circumstance, but opportunity often does. Every day, exceptional gifts go unrecognized simply because of where someone was born or the color of their skin. When we look beyond our assumptions and privilege, we discover the incredible potential in those we've overlooked. Our challenge is to create a world where all talents are nurtured, regardless of background. If this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can share stories that change perspectives and open hearts to a more inclusive future.